Hello everyone, Hafsa here, and today we're going to keep talking about character design. Last lesson we talked about how to recognize and understand the character proportions and body build to make sure that we can animate it correctly. And today we're going to talk about how we're going to add details to your character such as clothing, hair, and facial features. This is where we're going to give your character its distinct design and personality, and where we're going to make sure that the character art style is fitting with your character background and that we can understand how to animate all the details that you add to it correctly. We're also going to see how we're using the same principle that we did with the body shape, such as using simple shapes and understanding the range of movement according to the cuts of the clothing and the clothing materials, as well as the haircuts and facial features that your character is going to have, and how they affect the way that we're going to animate the character. Starting with the clothing, we already discussed how the body shape can affect the character appearance and the way that the audience is going to perceive them using different basic shapes which give the proportions and the character build its distinct impression. But a character shape design can give the audience certain indication about their personality and create expectations. Now, you can enforce and support these expectations by using clothing design which conforms to the body shapes, or you can divert these expectations of the audience by using clothing design which is different to the initial body shapes of the character. The easiest way to see if you're using a constructive or destructive clothing style for your character is by making it into a silhouette. Here you can see an example of how making different clothing choices to different body types can either enforce or destroy the initial impression that we have of that body type. You can see that some clothing still keep the general proportions of your character without obscuring them, while different variation of the clothing can make it so that it's harder to understand the initial character proportions as a silhouette. This is especially prevalent in more fantastical settings which use unconventional clothing, which can completely transform the initial shape of your character as a silhouette. Now, a lot of the time you're going to hear that your character silhouette needs to be immediately understandable and iconic, but this is not exactly true because a lot of the time, and especially in more realistic art styles, you're going to have characters with pretty standard clothing and silhouettes, so it's not that much of a concern. And sometimes your character palette is going to be more important than a certain character clothing choices. It is important that you, as a character designer or an animator, is very familiar with the type of design that you're trying to create and keep the proportions of it correct, the same way that we did with the actual body parts. So if you're using basic shapes to determine where each part of your clothing is, you need to make sure that they are being kept consistent whenever you're drawing the character in different poses. In this stage of your character design, try and think of the basic shapes that create the clothing, and not on the actual details and materials from which they are made of. This is where we only figure out the actual proportions and relative sizes of each part of the outfit, so just try and draw them in simple shapes for the time being. Now that we have the basic shapes of our clothing design, we want to understand how the design choices that we've made are going to work with the actual cloth animation that we're going to make. We want to make sure that we animate them correctly and that they're being kept consistent between each frame and pose. So in the same way that we have focused on volumes, proportions, and joy to figure out the motion range that we have for the original body shape, we want to emphasize the inherent material properties of the clothing to understand how they will be animated later on. So in illustration, this is something that people don't usually think about because you're only going to draw one version of your character in one pose and with one version of the clothing from one angle. You don't really have to think about how the cloth is actually going to move. You just need to make sure that it looks pretty for that single frame. But in animation, the way that you're going to draw the lines and folds of the clothing is going to change depending on the properties of the clothing. And you need to make sure that you understand it to stay consistent between frames. So generally, the cloths are going to form and fold around the character's body volumes, which means that you have to place them in a way that follows the basic shapes that we use for each body part. First, you need to recognize the points where the fold starts and ends. These are the tension points, and they will be created at any point where the material catches onto something. It can be either the body of the character or something in the environment itself, in the case that the character is catching onto something. So first you need to recognize these tension points. Usually if the character is in a neutral environment, you're going to have these tension points at the shoulders and at the chest area, because it's easier for the cloth to hang off of. Once you know where the tension points are, you just need to connect them with a line and curve it around the body volume. So don't just randomly curve it up or down. Make sure that it goes in the correct direction. This takes a little bit of trial and error and might change depending on the character pose, because sometimes your character is going to be in a position which makes certain parts of the clothing to hang, which would usually want to be hanged. But with enough practice and by using simple lines with simple shapes, you will be able to do that correctly. My personal tip is to not add a lot of folds to your clothing, because firstly, you're going to have to animate these additional lines for every frame of your animation, and also because it's really hard to keep them consistent and moving smoothly, especially if your character is going to perform very fast movements. So for the sake of the exercise, it's better to just use very simple shapes with 1 or 2 folds which indicate the direction of the volume of the character. If you're feeling more experienced though, try and have additional details for your design or even layered design. The way you draw your lines and folds will change the properties of your clothing though, so you need to make sure that you draw the appropriate amount of lines to convey the type of material that you're trying to animate. Thin cloth will have easier time conforming to the body shapes, giving it more opportunity to create tension points, which will create more folds, while stiffer cloths will have less tension points to them and will have less folds. You can show how firm fitting a cloth is by stretching it over the body as well, making it so that the folds themselves change direction to be more parallel to the ground than they would usually be if they are not stretchy. The amount of folds and the softness of the material are going to affect the actual range of movement that said material has. Because the softer the fabric is, the easier it is for it to move, because it will usually be thinner as well and will be more affected by large movement in the environment. Stretchy materials might make it so that your character actually has a limited range of movement, and stiff materials might make it so that it can't even perform certain actions, especially in something like armor or leather, which can completely alter the way that the character can move. You need to make sure that your clothing design doesn't clip into itself. So the more rigid your cloth is, the harder it's going to be, and the more consistent you're going to need to be when animating the character. If your material is very soft though, you can get around it by just adding extra folds which show it folding into itself, instead of the clipped look it's going to have otherwise. Usually this is going to be shown by a bigger range of movement as well, because the extra folds let you add extra fabric to your initial cloth design. Now that we know how to design the overall proportion of the clothing using basic shapes, and how to express different clothing materials using folds, we combine the two to create different variation of clothing for our character design. This is where the cuts and the materials are going to be expressed by the type of folds that we're going to be adding. This is also where we're going to determine the final range of movement that the clothing of our design have and how they affect the character's range of movement. We want to make sure that the design is functional both from a movement standpoint, because we want to make sure that the design itself is not clipping for itself, and also from a drawing standpoint. We want to make sure that the amount of folds and the layering of the clothing design is consistent and easy to understand, so that we can animate it properly without any issues later on. The way that we're going to draw the line and add the volumes to the clothing is going to be fully expressed by the amount of deformation that we're going to add to the line, as we're going to see in the later lessons. As you can see here, even with similar clothing design choices, we can have variation in the appearance of the clothing, which will be later expressed in the type of animation that it's going to perform, just with the amount of folds and the straightness of the lines that we add to our cloth design. As you can see here, just by making the lines a little bit more squiggly, it seems like the cloth material is way thinner and less form-fitting than when I use straighter and stiffer lines with less folds to show that the cloth material is more rigid. As a character designer, you're going to make multiple versions of your character design to show to your clients, and this is where you can also experiment for your own projects and try and have variation with the amount of folds and layers to create a different version of your character design until there is something that is both easy to draw and is aesthetically pleasing. Again, if you are a beginner, this is where you need to choose a simpler design. It can even be a simple t-shirts and shorts. You don't need to make something that is too complicated. If you are more advanced, you can try and experiment with more interesting cuts and more extra material, which is going to be animated with additional movements later on. We might be using this character design for the next exercises to make sure that you have something that is both easy to do and is aesthetically pleasing to keep you interested in the character design in the later lessons. The last thing you want to consider when designing your character is the actual process of animation. As I said at the beginning of the last lesson, animation is not the same as illustration. You have to draw each character a large amount of times. So this is also applicable to the clothing. Basically, the more details you're going to add to the clothing, the more time it's going to take to animate your characters, especially if these clothing have special properties which make them harder to animate. Theoretically, any type of design is able to be animated. It's just a matter of how much time you're willing to put into your project. In professional settings, this also means the amount of budget that you have for your project, because the more time it's going to take, the more you're going to pay your workers. To sidestep this problem, you just need to make sure that your initial design is practical and easy to understand. You need to remember that at minimum, you're going to duplicate each detail of your character outfit 8 times for a second, going up to 24 times. So something such as patterns or difficult cuts is going to be very difficult to animate and very time consuming. You want to limit the amount of details that you have or the actual complexity of the movement of the material. As you can see in this example, the time it takes me to animate the plain outfit is significantly shorter than the time it takes me to add all the patterns to the clothing. you can see that sometimes the pattern itself can actually harm the actual animation that you're going to do later on because it's clashing with the movement of the base material shape. This is also harder to animate when you have folds because you will need to shift the design to fit around the character volumes and to obscure it with the folds. You also want to consider how the amount of details affects the overall animation process, because it's not just sketching all the details once. It's sketching and then cleaning up those same sketches and then coloring all the small spaces and details in the software. This is going to be very time consuming on every aspect of your animation. So it's better to just go with a smaller amount of details or simplified amount of details if they are completely necessary, and not treat the character design as an illustration as you might have done in a different scenario. Moving on to designing your character's face, you want to give extra care to this part, because the human eye naturally focuses on the character faces. So no matter how pretty the actual clothing design is, if your face is inconsistent or unappealing, your audience is going to be disengaged with your animation. You want to have a design with a pleasing art style which clearly communicates the way that the character works, their personality, and also something that it's easy for you to replicate and keep consistent as the animator and designer. If you encounter a design which you are unfamiliar with, or if you're building a new design from scratch, you need to make sure that you understand the placement of the character features and their shape to keep your character consistent and recognizable. People have really good understanding of recognizing faces, so even slight variation in the shapes of the eyes, mouths, or overall head shape is going to be very noticeable and make it so that it's harder for the audience to recognize the character, or that it's going to give an uncanny valley to the entire scene, which the character is not quite on model. If you're pressed for time, it's more important to keep the face consistent than the actual body and outfit consistent. To make sure that you understand the face correctly, first you need to break it down to simple shapes to make sure that you understand the proportion and the correct placement of the character features on the face. This is where you're trying to compare shape sizes and where you find parallel lines or simple spheres and cones for the eyes and ears and overall head shape. You can create different character design by making slight variation to these shapes to give different impressions and features to your character. When designing your own characters, it's a good idea to use traditional face shapes such as circles and ellipses to make it easier for you to understand them and to add volumes easily later on. Once you have the base shape of the face, you just need to make it into volumes and add the features at the correct perspective and placement on the face within that volume. This again takes a little bit more practice, but just by morphing the features around, you can quite easily draw them in different angles. If you're a beginner, just try and place them at the correct places without adding many details, but if you feel confident in your skills, try and add extra features. At this stage, only try and add the eyes, nose, mouth and ears, and maybe hairlines, because we are only going to focus on the face at this point, and we will be talking about hair later this video. As you can see with this example, by making small changes to the features of your character, you can also create new designs and variation in your character look and their state, as well as show changes to your character age and expression. Same as what we've seen with the clothing and the small changes that we add to them to create variations in materials and designs. The location and size of the features on your character's face can create different variations and different characters in the same art style. This is both good and bad for us, because when we want to create new character for the cast, it's easy to just tweak the features a little bit to create new characters. This is also bad for us because with the human's ability to recognize faces instantly, even small variations to your character might create completely new impressions of the characters. So you need to make sure that you have the features of each character completely memorized and make them distinct enough so that your characters don't have the same face, which is usually leading to same face syndrome. Again, this might not be as big of a problem as you might think, because the overall look of the character with their clothing design and hair design is going to have a great effect on how the character is going to be remembered. But still, it's better if the face features themselves are unique and give a certain impression to the audience, which fits the character personality. As you can see with this example, just by shifting the features a little bit, I could completely age up the character, give them different expressions, or even make different character altogether with a different impression to the original one, all with different art styles while keeping the same base shape. This is also the stage where you figure out the range of movement of your character's facial features, because you don't want to make too many deformations when changing expressions with your character, otherwise you risk making your character seems like a completely different character. You will use the same technique that we used for the body and clothing materials, and pay special attention to the widening of the eyes, the opening of the mouth, and the overall motion of your head using the neck and jaw. In general, more squishy and round faces will have a greater amount of movement to them, because you can get away with giving the overall shape more elasticity and bouncing the features around. This also gives you more energetic animation. On the other hand, art styles with rigid lines which have very constructed faces will tend to have less dynamic animation, but with greater amount of character volume, so you need to strike a good balance with your character design. In anime specifically, you may encounter something quite interesting, where the entire face is quite flat and unmoving until the character itself is trying for a comedic effect, in which case any type of facial features are acceptable. Moving on to animating your character's hair, hairstyle and a haircut will give a different impression to your audience and will affect the way that you're going to animate the character's hair. Theoretically, the longer the hair, the bigger the range of movement it will have. But that is not actually the case when you animate, because the longer the hair, the heavier it is, and the less dynamic it will be. With the same logic, you'd think that short hair will move more than long hair. But this is also not quite correct, because with shorter hair you have shorter range, and it's harder to express the full range of movement. Middle length hair will have the best balance to show the biggest amount of movement in the hair while keeping it dynamic. Hair, unlike cloth, is made out of many individual and independent parts, meaning that its overall shape will change when moving and won't be consistent in the same way that the cloth is. You can get away with giving it much more variation and moving it way more erratically than you would with a single cloth. And you don't need to worry too much about how the different folds in it are going to move, because, well, it doesn't actually have folds, it has different parts to it. That being said, the weight of the hair and the texture of the hair is going to affect how you're going to animate it, as we're going to see later on. The important thing to remember about hair specifically is that because it's composed of many individual parts, it's not going to be animated in the same way in each part. The smaller the group of hair is, the more movement it's going to have because its weight is smaller in comparison to the rest of the hair. And as we're going to see later on, the amount of weight behind the movement is going to have a considerable effect on the way that we're going to animate it. Hair specifically is special because the amount of weight in every single hair is different in every part of the hair. The closer the hair is to the scalp, the heavier it's going to be because it has the entire length of the hair to support, while the bottom of the hair or the edges of it are going to be much lighter and thus move more quickly. You need to keep this in mind when choosing your character's length of hair in accordance to how much you want to animate it. This is also applicable to your character's hairdo because making the hairdo come from a single point, such as with a ponytail, or combining all the hair into a single hairdo, such as with a braid or with bun, is going to make the entire hair move differently. We're going to go into more details about animating cloth and hair in a later lesson, but for now try and go for a design which is easy to understand with a medium to long length hair so we can have a full range of movement when practicing on the characters later on. If you are more experienced, you can go with shorter or very long hair or with a specific hairdo which is harder to animate, but still try and leave areas which hang around so we can practice on animating hair without any obstructions. The next thing to consider is the actual hair texture, because similarly to the haircut, the hair texture will limit the way that the hair can move. Usually, straight hair will have easier time moving than curly hair, which tends to keep its shape, or hair that is styled in a certain way, which will have additional tension affecting the way that it moves. A lot of the time you will see that in anime, which has a lot of crazy hairstyles, which don't move as you might expect them or even like hair at all, and function more like helmets or hats. In general, you want to make sure that even if you are going to use special features for your character design, that the overall shape is one that is flexible enough to move. Otherwise, you're just going to have basically sculpted hair, which is not very dynamic. Last thing to remember though is that because we are working with animation which doesn't always obey the rules of reality, it might not even be a consideration for your design because you want to focus more on aesthetics. Still, you want to have these details in mind, because if you're going to animate them, you might want to have special animation. So just try and have your design pretty balanced and neutral for the sake of the later exercises. The last step to designing your character after we have the general body shape, the clothing design, the face features, and the hairdos is to choose the color palette that we're going to be using with the characters and creating the actual character sheet. For this part, you want to have both a traditional character sheet, as we've done it for the last lesson, and an action character sheet To see how you would realistically draw certain poses with the clothing and hair on. You want to make sure that you understand the relative sizes of each part of the design and how to convey the right cloth with the right amount of fold. You also want to make sure that your details are easy to understand and easy to keep consistent when animating your character in action. After you have your base, you might want to have a character design sheet with color in it. So for this stage, you can either clean up your animation and make the correct line art that you're going to be using for your project, or if you're using it for private use and don't feel like you need to have a clean version of your character sheet because, well, you're going to clean it later, you can just have your base colors directly on the rough sketches. At this stage, you only need to be concerned about making the character itself feel coherent and balanced with your color choices. So this is a very individual thing and you can choose whatever color palette you feel comfortable with. It can be realistic color, it can be saturated color, it can be any type of color. And you don't need to worry about lighting just yet, because this is part of the later compositing stages in animation. That being said, if you are working as an independent animator and have complete control over the overall color palette of your animation, you might want to make a specific color palette to your character, which is working well with the backgrounds and aesthetics of your scenes. So if you know that you have a dominant color in your background, you might want to consider not making your character have the same colors so that it will be easy to see when designing your other scenes. Usually, in big production, it's the job of the art team to make sure that each scene has consideration to color and lighting to make it easier for the audience to spot the character or hide it if need be. But if you're working as an independent animator, you are responsible for everything. So make sure that you choose colors that look good together on the character itself, and a general palette that works well with the background and lighting of the situation in your scene. We will be talking more about contrasting and complementary colors as well as color theory in the next background lessons, so you don't need to think about that quite yet, but still try and create a pleasing and somewhat neutral palette for your character right now, because we want to make sure that they're easy to fit in multiple types of scene. And again, the color palette of the character can be changed later on if you have a specific vision for the product for these exercises. If you haven't been following along throughout this video, the exercise today is to add the details to the character sheets that you've made in the last lesson. If you want, you can have extra difficulty by drawing different types of outfits, or try and make the outfits on different poses if you've made multiple ones in the last exercise. Make sure that the outfits and details that you choose keep the correct volumes of your character body, and that you keep them consistent between each character and pose that you draw. Try and add those details in the correct shapes and sizes by using the actual proportions of the character body itself, and not by using grids. Lastly, try and redraw your character poses on a separate layer without using the reference, while keeping your initial line as clean as possible. This is a pretty high-level exercise, so you don't have to make many of these, or you might not need to use them at all at this point. But this is a very good exercise for you if you want to be able to animate quickly later on. For the highest level exercise, you can draw these characters with their details in different poses while using an actual pen, so there is no erasing whatsoever. This will definitely force you to remember your character model and will make it so that you can draw them efficiently in every pose. In conclusion, your character features, details, clothing materials, and colors will greatly affect the look of your final product, your audience impression of your character, and the way that you're going to animate the character later on, as well as the amount of work that the character design is going to give to the production. As a character designer, You need to take all of these into consideration when creating your design to make sure that it is the best it can be for the production. Next lesson, we're going to continue with the pre-production stage and talk about the basics of creating backgrounds. See you next time, and thank you for watching. Bye!